The film department is supported by UNLV Film. At the film department of the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, every story has a beginning. With degree programs for undergraduates and graduates, state-of-the-art equipment and facilities, incredible professional internships around the world, and expert guest speakers, students discover the power and potential of cinema as they prepare for the film and television industry and beyond. Learn more at unlv.edu/film. UNLV Film. Find your voice, tell your story.
Welcome back to the Film Department Podcast, the official movie review podcast and more of UNLV Film. This semester we'll be partnering with the Beverly Theater, Las Vegas's only independent film theater, to discuss films being screened there. This week we discussed John Carpenter's seminal proto-slasher Halloween, and we figured, we just had so much more to say about it, so much more conversation left, that we decided we'd treat you guys to a bit of a bonus episode, a bit of a deep dive, if you will. I'm Davey Parks. I'm a UNLV fourth year film major, and I am so excited. And I'd like to throw it to Simona, who, was out during our original episode, but we'd love to hear your thoughts on, Halloween. What's up, Simona?
I know I was so sad to miss that episode, but I'm glad that we're doing this bonus episode to try to get more of a deep dive. Um, I think I can offer a bit of a different perspective on Halloween. Not to say that it's not a super important and seminal work in horror cinema, but when I first saw it, I wasn't the biggest fan of it. I think I approached it from the perspective that, like, oh, this is nothing new, like, it's kind of boring, it's a bit too predictable maybe, and so I kinda dismissed it just as, you know, a regular horror movie that didn't really have an effect on me, but revisiting it this time, I approached it from a different perspective, more on, like, how important it is in influencing horror cinema, and taking a look at it from that perspective, I understand more about why it has garnered such a name. I think it personally, from my perspective, I see that it all comes down to how accessible it is. It's not too extreme. The narrative isn't too crazy. I think it's suitable for so many different audiences, and I think that's also what contributed to how important it has become. And I think also with the film's kind of simplicity. I mean, it's not a super simplistic movie, but it isn't as crazy as some other things that I may be more interested in. But um, I kind of recognize that the simplicity of Halloween is kind of what gives it its charm. I think that it doesn't rely on, like, such a bizarre narrative, and John Carpenter does a great job with his direction in making it such a valuable work of horror cinema. And that's kind of my overall perspective of the movie.
Yeah, and it's really cool. You brought up influence too. I also just wanted to say, I mean, Halloween is it's one of the most influential movies ever made in terms of horror. And you said the first time you saw it, 'cause I think a lot of people, especially, people more our age, the first time they saw Halloween might have had a similar experience of like, well, I know what's going to happen. It's very predictable. She's going to fall down at some point when she's running away from Michael. And I
Yeah.
think, it's obviously, and you know this, but like it's important to understand that this movie kind of started all those tropes and it started all those cliches and it launched this, wave of slashers in the 80s, excuse me, like Friday the 13th, A Nightmare on Elm Street, like all these types of movies, all these tropes that you see, a lot of them do come from Halloween. So definitely it is very influential. And I can understand why you would have that experience the first time watching it. I think a lot of people did.
Yeah, I was honestly, like, realizing now I was just really ignorant because I enjoyed watching it this time around, and I understood its influence a lot more also, especially looking at other horror films that I love, like Nightmare on Elm Street, and, I can definitely see its influence in so many works that I love, and
Kind
I
of
I appreciate it for that.
kind of speaking to, I guess, like you're talking about like the accessibility of the movie.
Mhm.
um Pretty famously, this movie did pretty well at the box office and during its theatrical release, but really a lot of people, their first time paying attention to it was when it was broadcasted on NBC of all stations. Really like basic cable access, and there was a bit of editing involved in getting it to release. You know, having the FCC approve
Yeah.
having it released on Halloween night. But I think that's really interesting that this movie, that's a slasher movie that's widely regarded as like the birth of a genre that's famously very violent, very
Mhm.
exploitative, very, grindhouse-esque, really got its start for a lot of people on nationally syndicated broadcast television. And I think about how many kids every year I see dressed as Michael Myers. And I think that's really interesting that, for a lot of parents, the first horror movie that you show to your kid to really get them into the horror genre beyond, maybe Goosebumps or things like that that are geared towards children. For a lot of people, it's Halloween. It's the original, OG Michael Myers. It is sort of a safe bet to kind of get your kid interested in the idea of more mature horror. And I know that's kind of how it started for me. Was thinking about it, uh, having someone show me it for the first time. So I'm glad you brought that up.
I think it's cool, Davey, you brought up the television version of Halloween. That is a version of the movie that people can see if you have the Blu-ray, like the Shout Factory Blu-ray. It's on there. Just a little bit of history there. When Halloween first came out, back in the late '70s, movies they weren't released like they are today. Where today you have a movie and it opens in like 500 theaters across America
Yeah.
all at once. Back in the late '70s, what they would do is they would tour a movie. They would have it open in like St. Louis, and then they would move it to a different city, and then Kansas City or whatever. And so that's how Halloween started. And it was a very slow start. It wasn't an immediate success. Halloween was one of like the big movies in terms of like, it's a low budget independent movie. It was made for $300,000. And I can't remember off the top of my head how much it grossed, but it was considered one of the most profitable independent movies ever made because of word of mouth. A lots of people were going to the theater, they were seeing it and telling their friends and their family, like, hey, this movie's really scary. And then another big influence in that was Roger Ebert's review.
Mhm.
Roger Ebert was obviously a very famous critic, and he said that Halloween was comparable to Psycho in terms of being very scary as a slasher movie. And so that really helped garner a lot of attention. And then they decided to make Halloween 2 3 years later in 1981. And during that time, I believe the NBC premiere was just before Halloween 2 came out because they added a few scenes in the movie because the movie was only 90 minutes and they needed it to be 2 hours to fill the time slot. So Carpenter went back and filmed a couple of additional scenes that aren't really necessary to the film. But like you have an extra scene with Loomis at Smith's Grove, you have a scene with Laurie and her friends, and all of that was actually filmed concurrently while they were filming Halloween 2. So yeah, definitely the television version of Halloween is another big reason why it became such a success too.
I don't know why that made me think of this, but talking about the release of the movie, one thing I found out is that apparently this movie was really big in Japan when when it finally reached Japan. Was that Japanese audience reacted really strongly to it, and we were in my Japanese cinema class, and during a completely different conversation, Professor Keenan Diaz asked, what genre of film, if aliens came to Earth and you had to show them what American cinema is, like what do you think is the most prototypical American genre, like what can't be made in a different country? And I really felt inclined to argue that the slasher genre is like the most American genre because like the first instinct might be to say, superheroes, but other countries have superheroes. It's not a very limited American idea, but there's something about the concept of Halloween, and when we think about the other, proto slashers like Black Christmas, which is a Canadian film, but still, it's something that has to do a lot with a lot of really distinctly American anxieties. This idea that the past, that we've sort of covered up is going to come back to haunt us. The ideas of like suburbia, even just like the spatial blocking thing of like low density neighborhoods that are predominantly, not really well trafficked by pedestrians is something that's very American. And I think about Michael Myers as one of the great like inventions of American cinema because he just so distinctly strikes me as something very American. And I think a lot of that has to do with, I feel like John Carpenter is a very sort of patriotic filmmaker. I think he, whether he intends to or not, has a lot of love and appreciation for American culture and society that he really includes in his film. And part of that is he really loves a working class hero, and that includes Laurie, who like is very much She's a babysitter. It's like the first job a lot of women have when they're entering the workforce is babysitting. And I think that's really interesting that, when you think of all his movies, there's typically a very blue collar worker, and that includes Halloween, and it's not limited to gender. And that Laurie is a blue collar woman who becomes the lead of the film, which I think is really cool.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
think a lot of the horror elements do come from these things in Halloween. That's what I also noticed, that it does really involve the space and the atmosphere and kind of those American fears. And it doesn't, I feel like Halloween doesn't rely just on graphic violence. That's why also it's like more accessible. It wasn't extreme in that way.
Yeah, I think
definitely.
this movie is really like a masterclass in blocking and like spatial logic in film, because I feel like there's a pre-Halloween and post-Halloween in terms of how we shoot spaces in movies and how we as an audience are aware of like the layouts of houses or like the proximity of houses to each other. Where I feel like in a lot of older movies, we'll see a lot of interiors of houses and then we don't really see the exterior, or if we do, it's very much like the car pulls into the exterior and then the car pulls out, and we don't see anything outside of this like one very static shot. But so much of Halloween and the plot relies on our understanding of where the characters and where these locations are in proximity to each other. And I think
Yeah,
that's really cool. And how you watch the movie and you get a really firm understanding for the layout of the Myers house, of the houses that are being babysitted,
yeah.
just the layout of this neighborhood in general. I think that's really cool.
Definitely, yeah. It's, I think it was a great creative choice. It probably came out of necessity, but the idea of having the Wallace house and the Doyle house being across the street from each other, it really does give you sort of that spatial awareness of where everything is. And, I think another important thing too, you mentioned this earlier, the idea of the town and suburbia in America. Haddonfield as a town, it's obviously a fictional town, but it is a character in and of itself, especially in this movie. I feel like that's something that gets kind of lost throughout the series where it's more about the kills and Michael and less about the town itself. But the town is almost its own character, and you feel like you know this town because you spend so much of the first and second act exploring this town. You're seeing the train station, you're seeing the hardware store, you're seeing the schools. I mean, like you really do get to like learn this town, and you get to learn these people. I think one of the best scenes of that too is the walk and talk when Lori, Annie, and Linda are walking and they're talking, on the sidewalk, and you're just getting used to the houses and stuff. And Haddonfield, like I said, fictional town. It was the name comes from Haddonfield, New Jersey, because that's where Deborah Hill grew up. But they did film in Pasadena, California, which is funny. You can kind of tell there are some shots where you can see there's palm trees in the background. There's no palm trees in the American Midwest. You can see mountains in the background. That's obviously not supposed to be there either. It's because they shot it in California. But there's, and especially like if you look at the picture behind you too, if you've been to Pasadena, if you've driven down those streets where they filmed, it does look so weirdly like not California. It looks like the American Midwest. So I think it was a great choice for them to film there, even though yes, you can see, palm trees and stuff, but it does give the town itself its own identity.
Well, there's even really great little creative choices, like the fact that they shot this movie in the middle of summer and all the trees are green and all the bushes are green, but just little simple things like having a fan and tossing dead leaves in front of the camera so that you get the appearance of falling leaves to give the illusion of fall is such a clever little trick, but it works so well. Because I
Yeah.
think when a lot of people think about this movie, me included, I think of very fall aesthetics. I think of orange and, very like browns, but it's a very green movie, but they do such a good job of tricking you into thinking it's set during Halloween.
You're right,
Yeah.
I didn't even, like, notice any of that, like, now I'm just realizing how kinda seamless that was and those choices were, even if they were, like, Jeff said, a necessity in some ways with the houses also, and yeah.
Yeah. And a lot of because I've heard that too from like the hardcore Halloween fans of like, well, the first Halloween doesn't really have that much of a fall aesthetic. And you're right, technically it doesn't because like you said, it's shot during the summer, the trees are green, but it's more in, I think, also to the lighting, especially it's like during the nighttime scenes, you have this blue lighting. Again, you have to give a shout out to Dean Cundy, the cinematographer of this movie. He really shot the hell out of this movie. It's so well shot. It's so beautiful, and the lighting is so good too, with this blue lighting that you get and these like, epic wide shots of the houses. You feel like it's a cold autumn night. You feel that, I think, and that's important too.
Yeah, for sure. I really think this movie captures the essence of Halloween in a way that, like, if I had to explain to someone who had no idea what Halloween was or what, the holiday entails, I would just show them this movie and be like, see, like, it's such a perfect encapsulation. And it really it exists in my mind in that, like, kind of atmosphere of movies that, like, Stranger Things takes, like, inspiration from, of that very, like, adolescent wonder suburbia kind of thing. Because so much of this movie, I really enjoyed, is shot from the perspective of not just teenagers, but children and kids, which I think also kind of throws in that appeal of um, why it's the first horror movie a lot of people show their kids, because it's very rooted in this, like, childlike perspective, not just in the opening scene where, we find out Michael is just a child when he commits these murders, but, like, all the scenes at the elementary school I think are, like, really cool and, like, really nostalgic. Everything with, like, Lonnie at the Myers house. There's a lot of, like, childlike sort of wonder involved in this movie.
Mhm. By the way, that is my favorite scene in this entire movie, when Lonnie goes to the Myers house and Loomis pulls that prank on him. Hey, Lonnie, get your ass away from there. It's so funny. But definitely. And, another thing too with that also is they specifically say Michael Myers is the boogeyman, which is a very childish term, right? Like that's something that like usually like a young child would say, like, oh, the boogeyman's in my closet. And you kind of hear it from an adult and it kind of sounds silly. Like, why are you saying this? But by the time you get to that final scene of the movie, when Laurie has that realization, like she has an arc in this movie, right? She doesn't believe in the boogeyman. Tommy asks her, like, what's the boogeyman? She's like, oh, it's not real. It's make believe. And by the time she gets to the end, she's like, oh, it was the boogeyman. And Loomis says, like, of course it was. It doesn't, at least for me in that moment, it doesn't feel cringy, or it doesn't feel like, oh, that's like kind of a weird childish thing, because it makes sense by the time you get to that point in the story that yes, Michael is the boogeyman. He is pure evil. He represents the fear that we all have. And I think it also goes to show too that it's more than just a child fear. It's something that adults are afraid of as well too.
Yeah, also, can I just say that I think Michael Myers is, like, the absolute like, the most absolutely terrifying, like, classic horror cinema villain ever. I just think that, um, for his appearance and kind of just his existence and what he represents is just absolutely terrifying to me. Another aspect that really contributes to kind of not necessarily the most explicit, like, horror representation that this movie displays, but more of the atmospheric and kind of um, spatial horror that it creates.
Well, I feel like even a good example of how simple it is to make a really threatening character is Michael breaks a taboo that you don't often see in cinema, and that's animal violence. He kills a dog fully
Mhm.
on screen, and then off screen is implied to be eating dogs,
He
which
ate a
is,
dog. Yeah.
yeah, like, so, like, that's shocking for audiences now, like, that's something that when I show people today, people go, "Oh, like, I can't believe he killed a dog," like, that's something you don't really see in horror films, but it's something that they did way back in the '70s, which I can't imagine how shocking that would be, which again is so, like, it embodies the idea that, like, Michael is here to cause disruption and bring evil to the American suburb because he's killing, like, the very American pet. He's murdering a dog, and it's so
Mhm.
symbolic of he's running through and he's, like, destroying all these, like, symbols of, like, domesticity. And you can even, like, look into that from, like, a film theory perspective of, like, the items that he's using to kill people are, like, very domestic objects, it's, like, the
Mhm.
telephone, the knife, even, like, the car that he kills one of the teens in, like, it's very Americana, it's very domestic life, and I found that really interesting too.
Absolutely. I also want to propose one more thing too. Another reason why I think Michael is so scary that not a lot of people usually talk about. When people kind of think of because obviously Michael is such a famous image. Like a lot of people, like even if you don't know Halloween, you know what he looks like because he's just
Mhm.
so embedded into the pop culture zeitgeist. But a lot of people kind of mistakenly think that, oh, he's this big, tall man in this big, brooding uniform with the mask. But he's actually very, he's not that tall in this movie. He's like 5'8", I think, Nick Castle. So he's, Tom Cruise's height in this movie. And so he's just like a regular guy. He's not super built. He's not massive. He's not very intimidating from a physique standpoint. He's more intimidating, I think, from the fact that, for the first two acts of the movie, is sprinkled throughout the film, but you're usually seeing him from a distance, right? You don't actually get to see him up close for a lot of the movie. You see him, when he's standing outside the classroom, he's at a faraway distance. You can't really get a good look at his mask. Or when he's standing behind the bush and he's stalking them, you can't really get a good look at him there either. In fact, the first time you actually really get to see a good look of the mask is when he kills Linda and he raises the phone to his head. And so I think that's another reason too that makes him so scary, is the fact that he's just a regular looking guy in a regular, mechanic outfit with this mask, and you don't really get to see him up close. And the whole movie, he's just getting slowly closer and closer and closer to the camera until you get that, epic reveal later on.
Yeah, for me that also really contributes to how terrifying he is, because you really don't get a good look at him and you don't really exactly know, I guess, what kind of character you're dealing with almost, when he's kind of just there in the background and kind of wandering from place to place and just appearing, disappearing, and yeah, I like when you kind of still have that mystery. I think it makes a movie a lot more a character, horror character a lot more
Yeah.
effective.
Yeah, sort of like the mystique of him. I think that is 100% what makes him so scary in the first one, and that is something that gets lost in this franchise. Is in the next film, spoiler alert, guys, but you find out that Laurie and Michael are brother and sister, and he's coming after his long lost sister, and it takes away from that, because in the first movie he's just a crazy guy who escapes a mental institute, goes back to his hometown, and the only reason he goes after Laurie in this movie is just because she was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Her father's a real estate agent. He's selling the Myers house, so she has to go drop off the key, and Myers happens to be there, and he sees her. And from that moment on, he sets his sights on her and stalks her throughout the day. And I've always thought that's just so much scarier than any motive, any cult. You know what I mean? Like it is a lot scarier. The idea that just this random guy with absolutely no motive at all is going to be like that, hard driven on hunting you down.
Well, I
Yeah,
think
I was
even
wondering, sorry.
right. I was just gonna say, even in how Michael presents himself, it was very transgressive for the time, because you think about the killers that came prior to Michael, and they're these very glassy-eyed lunatics. We're talking about Black Christmas, this very vocal killer who's very off the hook and kind of ranged. Leatherface is this big brooding guy who's always like making like animal noises and grunting. Even Norman Bates is this very he's shy, but when we find out that he's got this like wide-eyed expression of just insanity on his face. Michael, I feel like, is one of the first killers put to screen who's just blank, and I think that's a really interesting choice and a really important one that John Carpenter and Deborah Hill made, is that this isn't just a glassy-eyed lunatic; it's just a pure embodiment of evil.
Right. I mean, and even the fact that you can hear his breathing under the mask, you know that there's a human being under that mask. You know that there's somebody that's an actual person. I think that also kind of leads into a conversation that a lot of people have in this movie, which is Michael Myers specifically in this first movie? Like, again, if you get into the sequels, it's a different conversation. But in this first movie, whether or not he's supernatural. And I think everybody kind of has their own perspective on that. I tend to go with what Carpenter said, which is that he is a human being in this movie with a slight supernatural edge. There's something about him that's just off in the way that he's able to move around so quickly, in the way that he can kind of, he's at the door and now he's inside the window and now he's over here. And then by the end of the movie, he gets shot 6 times, and a lot of people will say, well, like, that proves that he's supernatural. The fact that he got shot and stabbed in the eye and stabbed in the neck and he still survived. And a lot of people have survived worse than that. So it's not really out of the realm of possibility that a human being could survive what Michael does endure in this movie. Just my opinion. What do you guys think? Do you guys think Michael is supernatural or no in this one?
I I like the idea that he's not, because that's just so much scarier. But I think I think what plays really well is that ambiguity, especially for the character's perspective. I think it's scarier. It doesn't really matter whether or not he's supernatural. It's scarier whether the characters in the film think he is. And I think by the end, when we see Lori, who up until that point has been this really kind of like jovial girl who is like really relaxed and maybe studious, but she's, she's nice and she has life behind her eyes. And the last time we see her, she's this cowering, scared woman who has just realized that the boogeyman is real. Like that, I think, is one of the scariest images of the movie, is just what is left of this character that we've been watching this whole time after she's gone through this whole ordeal. And Loomis's pursuit of Michael adds so much to that tension. It really is like, I think Halloween and Jaws go so well side by side because Michael is just a shark, and the whole thing of, you really can't have a good horror movie without having someone say something bad's gonna happen. You guys aren't listening to me, and then having people not listen to them. So yeah,
Definitely.
Yeah, I also I think when it comes to whether Michael is a supernatural being or not, I would like the I prefer the idea that he is not, because it's kind of just crazy to watch someone go through all that and still be fine and still like get back up and just keep doing his crazy things. But I agree with Davey on that. I think it's scarier to wonder whether the characters in the movie think Michael is supernatural or not. I like that idea.
Yeah, one analogy that Carpenter brought up that I really like is that Michael is sort of like the wind, in that, like when you have like a big storm and the wind blows down somebody's house, it's not because the wind had a vendetta against that person's house. The wind simply destroys because that's what it does. And that's sort of what Michael is as well. He doesn't really have a vendetta against anybody, he doesn't have a personal reason. There's a lot of people who do say, like, you can kind of get into the psychosexual subtext of this movie, that like, no, he's actually fascinated with teenage girls that look like his sister. But again, he also does kill a mechanic. He kills a dog. I don't necessarily think that his goal is to kill teenage girls that look like his sister. I don't think his goal is to kill, these horny babysitters because they remind him of how his sister, babysat him and she decided to go have 1 minute sex with her boyfriend that only lasted 1 minute, by the way. And, so I personally don't really buy into that. What do you guys think? Do you think that's something that's there?
I mean, watching it, I was like always wondering kind of like what's his motive, why he's doing that, but I really don't. Yeah, I just think he is like just the pure embodiment of evil and that he really does not
I
present any motive in the movie. I mean, the point that you bring up, Jeff, the psychosexual aspects of it, those are interesting to consider, but not sure.
I think it's always interesting. Like I think it's something that you can't remove when you have a movie about a male killer who uses a knife and you're focusing on women. Even outside of like the film theory stuff of like, oh, knife is phallus, there's always the threat of sexual violence. Like even before, it's never mentioned or it's never, implied that Michael has an affliction for sexual violence. When you have a scene of three high school girls walking in a neighborhood and a guy passes by them slowly and is like looking at them, there's that threat is right there. And whether, you remove it from that context or not, it's always kind of this like ever present thing that, not only is he a killer, could he be a killer and also someone willing to inflict sexual violence on the victims that he's, doing these acts against. And I do think it's really interesting that, you know, one of the characters who gets murdered is in the nude, and another character who gets murdered is almost in the nude, and Michael pays no attention to that. There's no scene of like Michael like trying to like do anything that's even remotely sexual, and I think that's really interesting. It almost like implies to me a level of like adolescence to Michael, that
Mhm.
even though he's still evil and he's very, like the wind, like a shark, there's almost still like a childlike aspect to him that like sexuality isn't even there or present for him.
Right, because he spends his entire life in a mental institution. I mean, he has no, he almost has like probably no idea what sex even is. I would doubt that they taught sex ed at Smith's Grove, honestly, so I'm sure he doesn't know.
Apparently, they taught driver's ed, which
They
is
did teach driver's ed, yes.
I've always found that really funny because I don't wanna even say at what age I realized you don't drive with both feet. And so for Michael to figure that out, I thought that's really impressive of him.
Wait a minute, you don't drive with both feet? I'm just finding this out for the first time now. Shit, I can't believe I got my license. But yeah, no, also one other thing too, just kind of going back real quick to what we were just talking about, the closest thing you do get to that is there is a specific shot where Michael is very clearly watching Linda and Bob have sex. And, you would kind of think like, well, why doesn't he just go attack them right there? Like, right, like he has his two victims there. I mean, you could kind of slice into that pie any way you want. I sort of see it as, well, one, you wouldn't get the two awesome scenes that follow, which is the really iconic scene when he stalks Bob, and he pins him to the counter with the knife, and then the scene where he throws on the ghost costume and chokes out Linda, which also goes to show that Michael, like you said, going back to the adolescent idea, he has a sense of humor. He loves theatrics. He likes to play with his food a little bit, and that's something I've always kind of appreciated about his character.
To the point of carrying a gravestone, all which I can't imagine is not heavy, all the way to the house, up the stairs, and then putting it on the bed, which is, yeah, he really likes to make art out of his victims, which I always found as
Yeah.
a characteristic of him.
Yeah, he's a Halloween decorator, and I appreciate that. I get it. I also we didn't really talk about this last time like at all, and I feel like you can't talk about Halloween without talking about the score. I mean, the music in this movie is arguably more iconic than the movie itself. I mean, you have people, you'll hear the Halloween theme. I have a 6-year-old nephew. He's never seen any Halloween, but he knows the Halloween theme. He understands when he hears those piano notes. Oh, this is Halloween. It's so iconic. And just a little bit of backstory with the score. Carpenter did the score himself. There's sort of this urban legend that originally he showed a rough cut of the movie to a test audience and it didn't have music and it wasn't scary. And then he went back in, recorded the music, put it in, and now everybody's like, oh my God, it's so scary. There's some debate on whether or not that's true. But either way, certainly, if you imagine this movie without the score, it definitely would lose, I would argue, at least 50% of the scariness. So much of it comes from that music. And you go to the opening Halloween theme, it's very simple, but it's very repetitive, right? It's the same notes over
Yeah.
and over and over again, kind of how Michael is always going after people. He's always, he keeps coming back. He keeps, you can kill him, but then he'll come back alive and he'll keep coming after you. Kind of
Mhm.
like that score.
Yeah, it's kinda grating, and it kind of, like, honestly gets on my nerves a little bit. Like, I think it's so iconic, but watching the movie, it's like, when is this gonna end? Like, same with, everything that Michael is doing. And, I know the backstory of, like, the whole, score and how, Carpenter, showed it without the music and that it wasn't scary. I tried watching, like, 10 minutes without like, on mute, and well, yeah, kind of on mute just to kind of get the feel of that, and yeah, I mean, that's kinda true, like, the score is really effective.
Even
It's still very visually. Oh, sorry.
I was just gonna say, even outside of the main theme, the two secondary themes, the Laurie's theme, the very like the piano, is so. There's like three themes that just get kind of remixed and like rearranged throughout the film, and it's the main theme, Laurie's theme, and then like the Shapes theme, the like don
Mhm.
don kind of
Don't
thing
know.
going on. And
Yeah.
I really especially love Laurie's theme because I think that's another way that Carpenter tricks us into thinking that it's fall because it is such a fall kind of sounding
Yeah.
thing. And I'm also I'm not even sure if you would call this score or like sound effects, but that balloon deflating jump scare they have throughout the film is
Yeah.
so interesting to me. Like
Yeah.
how
It is in the score.
yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, that like those sound effects are also part of the score as well. That's not something that was like thrown in the mix. So if you do listen to the original like Halloween soundtrack, I have it on CD. That stuff is all in there. Like there's also another one too that I love. The scene when Michael escapes for the first time and you see him, he's in his white hospital gown, he jumps on top of the car when he goes to attack the nurse. There's like a really funny, like very kind of 80s sounding like going on and it's just so fun. I love the different sound effects that are in the score.
Yeah, there was one thing that I kind of, like, noticed throughout the movie. I don't know if it's because of, like, Carpenter's desire to kind of add horror or add fear to the movie using the score, but, like, each time I've watched this, I've noticed that there are parts of the movie that are kind of overpowered by the score to the point where it's kind of difficult to hear what the characters are saying. I'm not sure if anyone else has noticed that, but
I think that happens when, like, they're the scene where they're just, like, walking and talking, and it's that
yeah.
scene where you get the really good improvised line from PJ Souls where she's like, "Oh, I forget my textbook, and I forget my history book, and my English. Oh, who needs who needs books anyways? Books are, and like you hear her like audio mixing kind of fade, and that like really like the soundtrack
Right.
kicks in. Yeah,
Well, I think also that's because specifically that's also when you first see Michael driving next to them. So I sort of interpret it as like, oh, what she's saying is just it doesn't matter, obviously.
Mhm.
Like what's important is Michael, and that's why it turns scary and it kind of drowns out her dialogue. But I certainly do get what you're saying. It's a very score heavy mix. Like the score is very front
Yeah.
of the mix compared to the dialogue. So yeah, I would agree. Um, yeah, so I mean that's the score of Halloween. There's so much else to talk about. I mean, another big thing too, just like you said, like the opening too. This is the first time you hear the score. I love that sort of iconic pumpkin credits where you have this pumpkin, you have these orange credits. Again, getting you into that fall mood, kind of going back to how do you get people into that aesthetic? Well, you start with a pumpkin, like and just a very simple carving. You have this really scary score, and the camera is just very slowly pushing in on the eye until it just fades into blackness, and then you hear the kids, saying like black cats and goblins and broomsticks and ghosts. So it just really gets you just from like the opening before you even get into Michael killing Judith. It already you're just so dropped into that Halloween mood, and then you get to the opening scene, which is its own beast in and of itself.
now I've always heard that there's a bit of like a subliminal image in the pumpkin's eyes. Is there any truth to that? Because I look for it every time and I don't see it.
There is, yeah. So if you go into the eye, the idea is that it is a silhouette from the side of Michael holding a knife. The nose is the knife. It has sort of the handle at the bottom. It's kind of hard to see because they carved it very quickly. If you do watch Halloween 2018, the newest one, David Gordon Green of this new trilogy, it has the same pumpkin with the same design, and it's a little bit more obvious in that one because they carved it just a little bit more precisely. But yeah, there is supposed to be the and I think also that comes from originally they wanted it to be Michael's mask, and the camera was going to push in slowly on the mask, but that just didn't work out for whatever reason. So they compromised with a pumpkin, but they still wanted to put some sort of Michael into that pumpkin, and that's the eye and the nose. So yeah,
I
And what
see.
very
I've actually never heard of that. I feel like I need to go check this out to see what's
maybe
going
just because I
on.
go crazy every time I watch it, I'm like, "Where is," like, I can't find it,
it's
but,
yeah, it's sweaty nerd stuff for sure.
yeah, even just going on beyond the actual film itself, the poster is something that is
Yes.
so iconic that has always stuck with me. Yeah, like,
Mhm.
back in the days of physical video media stores, I feel like everyone has, like, those, like, horror movies that they remember as a child passing by and really sticking with them, and the Halloween poster was always one that really stuck with me because it's just such a simple design, but it works so well, and the tagline, "The night he came
He
home," is so effective and really
Mhm.
speaks to the idea of, horror in the heartland, horror at the house.
yeah,
It almost, like, makes me think of, like a divorced dad or something, like, coming back, like, it's very familial in that way.
yeah.
So yeah, that's
Do,
Halloween.
Davey, real quick, do you just because you brought up the poster, do you know about the face that's in the hand as well? That's something that there's another kind of subliminal thing that's in there.
Well, isn't it, like, in, like, the reflection of the
It's
handle thing?
yeah, so like if you look at the hand hold, I'm just looking because I have this poster on my wall. If you look at the hand holding the knife, like the top knuckle, like the knuckles kind of form what looks like a face being suffocated.
Mhm.
I don't know if that was intentional, but once you see it, you can't unsee it. That's certainly there too. I know we're also about to wrap up. Can I just also real quick? I want to bring up one more quick thing, just because like a little fun fact. Do you know about the puff of smoke in this movie? Do you know about this? This is another kind of sweaty nerd thing about this movie.
You don't.
There is you kind of have to go back and see it and specifically find that shot, but it's the scene when Lori sees Michael standing behind the bush. She's with Annie. Annie goes and she kind of plays with her like, "Oh, Lori, dear, he wants to ask you out or whatever." There's a shot of Annie and you can see a puff of smoke coming in from the right of the frame, and it kind of goes in and it sort of like dissipates. And what that is it's John Carpenter smoking a cigarette while they were filming that scene, and he just didn't care enough. And so he just puffs it, and you can see it go into frame. And it's one of my favorite moments to point out, like whenever I'm watching with somebody, like, look, that's the smoke. It's John Carpenter's puff of smoke. Anyways, another fun fact for
No,
you guys.
because there's so many incredible pieces of trivia that we could just dedicate a whole other hour to. William Shatner is Michael Myers' face.
Yep.
They're on the TV, they're watching The Thing, the original 1950s sci-fi movie that John Carpenter would later famously go to remake, and in a much better form.
Oh,
So
I love
many
the thing so much.
Yeah,
Oh
just so
yeah.
many incredible touches and really simple things that add so much character to this movie. Um, Simone, we didn't get to hear your thoughts as to whether or not you would recommend this. What would you say to anyone who's curious or on the fence about seeing Halloween?
I think that anybody who has not seen Halloween should definitely see it. Like, I think this is like, I mean, I don't know if I would go as far as to say that, like, if this is the only movie that you could watch, you should watch this, but I think if this is the only horror movie that you could watch, you should watch this. You should prioritize at least seeing Halloween at least once. I mean, I watching it the first time, I didn't really get it, but then again, I was kind of ignorant to the influence that it has, especially as someone who loves horror movies. I mean, I'm more attached to more extreme stuff, more body horror, and so I think that's also kind of what made me so dismissive of how important Halloween is, but I think, you know, I think this movie you have to see because after all, it is really enjoyable and influential if you're a horror lover.
I would venture to argue, I would venture to argue that this is like the godfather of horror cinema in the sense that
Yeah.
you really
Yes.
can't consider yourself a horror fan or even really a cinephile in general if you haven't seen Halloween. Like, I think it's
Mhm.
really definitive to just, like, film language as a whole, even outside of the horror
Mhm.
genre. I think if you like film, if you respect film, you need to see Halloween just because it's done so much, not just for the genre, but cinema as a whole. Jeff, I'm gonna take it you probably won't recommend this movie. No, just kidding.
No, I don't think anybody should see it, honestly. And Simona, I also think too. I think you're being a little harsh on yourself, saying like, "Oh, it's ignorance." It's not so much that it was ignorance. I don't think, because I also remember I went to see Halloween. I think at the Orleans once, because for some reason it was just playing there, and there was like a group of young people, and I noticed throughout the movie that usually when you're supposed to be scared, they were laughing a lot. I think it's just because,
Yeah.
people of our generation, we're sort of used to movies in a different way. We're used to things flowing differently. We're not kind of used to that sort of like, again, it's a kind of bit of a slow burn in the beginning of Halloween. And there are certainly, the dialogue is quite wooden. The acting, especially from, Nancy Loomis's Annie, is a little questionable. Even like something is like when you see their dead bodies in the closet, the faces they're making are kind of funny. So like I get it. I do. I think a lot of people have had that experience. I would just tell our listeners, college students, if you haven't seen Halloween for the first time, you have to view it not from a modern lens because it's a dated movie. It's made in 1978. It's very dated. But
Yeah.
you have to look at it. I think the timelessness of it, the reason why it's so iconic, the reason why it inspired this, 13 movie franchise is because of the themes of evil and the themes of darkness and its influence and all the tropes it created. And you have to look at it from a lens of how was this movie viewed in 1978 instead of how is it viewed today. Yes,
Yeah,
I do recommend Halloween.
I think I think where like the reason why I'm kind of more harsh on myself is because I typically like I feel like I have the lens to kind of appreciate older works too, and so I felt like I was unnecessarily kind of like critical of Halloween with kind of what I'm interested in general.
Yeah.
I think speaking to maybe how dated this movie is, I watched it once with my probably, like, 9 or 10-year-old cousin, and they asked me, "Why are these old ladies going to high school?" And I think they thought that because they have their hair and makeup and clothes done in a way that were probably really hip and, like, swanky in the '70s, but
Yeah.
are
Yeah.
traditionally associated with older people now, that they thought that these characters were a lot older than they were supposed to. I could very much see that, but that being said, Jeff, I wanted to ask you, if someone watched Halloween, they really enjoy it, where do they go from there? Do they watch all of the rest of the Halloween movies? As our resident expert, where do you go from Halloween?
Well, real quick, just before I answer that, I just want to go back to what you said. So Jamie Lee Curtis was 17 at the time of filming. She was the only one of the three teenagers in this movie who was like an actual teenager. I think PJ Souls, I think she was in like her mid 20s at that point, and I'm pretty sure Nancy Loomis was closer to 30. But yeah, Jamie Lee Curtis was an actual teenager, and I think you can kind of see that on her face. She does have sort of that like
Yeah.
bit of a naive, young, it makes her very empathetic, especially compared to her friends because they do seem a little bit older than her. It, kind of makes their
Mhm.
deaths not, as impactful, I don't
Oh, I
think,
guess
as
we
if
didn't even
Lori
talk
were to
about
die.
why they casted her.
But, oh, well, she's the daughter of Janet Leigh, who was in Psycho. Yeah, absolutely. That was, yeah, she is technically a Nepo baby, right? Jamie Lee Curtis, she did kind of get hired
Yeah.
because of that. Yeah, but yeah, even she was considered horror royalty because her mom was Marion in Psycho, and yeah, very iconic character who gets killed in arguably the most iconic death scene in any movie, where she gets killed in the shower. So that was a big reason why she was hired. But I also think too, there was a story I remember reading where Jamie Lee Curtis was like, "Oh, I thought I was so bad that I was going to get fired any minute." Like I was like, "Oh no, my performance was terrible." And Carpenter would call her every night and say, "Hey, you're doing great. Like, don't worry. You're keep doing what you're doing." And I think she gives an awesome performance in this movie. I love Jamie Lee Curtis in this movie. I
I
think this is a
agree, I
movie.
thought her performance was great.
Yeah,
Like,
absolutely. Going back to what you said, Davey, there's a lot of timelines involved. Again, we're 13 movies deep. I actually just finished rewatching all of the Halloweens for October. I just got done with Ends, so they're all kind of fresh on my mind. There's so many ways you can go about watching Halloween. You can go with the original timeline, which would be Halloween, Halloween 2, Halloween 4, 5, and 6. And then they rebooted it in the late 90s with H2O. So now it would be Halloween, Halloween 2, Halloween H2O, and Halloween Resurrection. Or just don't watch Resurrection at all because that movie is a colossal piece of shit and it's terrible. You could watch the Rob Zombie remakes, which I am not a big fan of. I know they have their fans. I personally am not one of them. Or you could watch this newer timeline, which gets rid of all of the sequels, and it's Halloween 1978. And then now we have this new David Gordon Green trilogy. Um, all of them have their merits. I love Halloween 2 from the 80s. I know, Davey, we've talked about that movie gets kind of a bad rap because, yes, it does have the brother sister angle, which I personally am not a fan of, but it's very aesthetically close to this movie because it was made only a few years after. It's shot by Dean Cundey, written by John Carpenter. So it's very, very similar to this movie. And it's a really good kind of 1-2 combo because they're all set on the same night. Um, I think the best way to get the story of Michael Myers, I said this in the last our last meeting as well, is just watch the first one because truthfully, none of the sequels have ever lived up to the greatness of the first Halloween, and it's a complete story. And it doesn't need to see what happens, more of the night he came home because this movie has a message, it has a theme, and by the end of it, it tells you that theme exactly, which is that Michael is pure evil and evil never dies. Evil will always be there. It ends with these shots of the house and you hear him breathing, he's everywhere. And I think that is a much scarier conclusion to that story than any sequel could have possibly given us. So my recommendation would be just watch the original Halloween because it is, in my opinion, a masterpiece.
All right, well, that about wraps up our thoughts on Halloween 1978, which will be showing at the Beverly October 28th to October 31st, along with a few other films, which I would like to shout out. Poltergeist will be showing on Halloween night, along with, I found out, the presidential inauguration of Donald Trump in 2017, which the Beverly simply states in their description of it, you cannot begin to imagine how truly terrifying it is, which is really funny.
That's awesome.
Yeah, so great things going on at the Beverly. Go check it out. If you have an open Halloween, go see Halloween or Poltergeist are another good choice. But yeah,
Yeah.
that wraps up our thoughts.
Happy Halloween, guys.
Happy Halloween!
Safe trick or treating.
Imagined by the Rogers Foundation, the Beverly Theater brings cinematic connectivity, novel collaborations, live happenings, cultural portals, and a zest for independent spirits to downtown Las Vegas. With a mission to stage uncommon cinematic, literary, and live experiences, the Beverly Theater is Las Vegas's first and only independent film house, storytelling arena, and live music venue. Check out our event calendar at thebeverlytheater.com.